so hard to prepare for this interview, and I just appreciate you giving us a little bit of your time. So
Sure.
we'll try not to keep you on too long, but I do have a few interesting questions, and hope I have the chance to maybe tap your brain a little bit here.
Sure.
First of all, welcome. The radio show is called Time and Space, and my name is Mike Smith. I'm the host of the show. I have my producer, Howard, with me here today. And we cover a wide variety of material. We try to do it in a very sort of lighthearted manner, but I also tend to be a little more eclectic than your average, shall we say, comedy show host, and I try to get a little bit into the material that's covered by the guests that we have. So I was really looking forward from the first time I ever heard you interviewed. I've been looking forward to having a chance to speak with you. So first of all, how is everything out in South Dakota? You said you're out in the Black Hills. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm on the northern edge of the Black Hills in a town of about 10,000 people called Spearfish. I'm about an hour and 20 minutes kind of north of Mount Rushmore, to give you an idea of where I'm at. So.
Sure. My family, my in-laws actually just went out that way and visited that area. I've never been out that way, though. And actually, Howard, you had a question from earlier. You said something about riding motorcycles, right?
Do you ever go to Sturgis?
Sturgis is about 20 miles from me, so I pass by it every time I go down to Rapid City, which is fairly often. So yeah, I'm pretty close to it.
Population, all but like 10 days out of the year, it's like 5,000 people, and then it's like swells to like 500,000, right?
Yes, something like that. It certainly seems that way. We have more Harleys than people here when the bike rally is going on.
Yeah, I've been to Daytona Bike Week a couple of times, so.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's the reason I was curious when I saw the South Hills, or the Black Hills, excuse me. I was like, oh, yeah, sure. I got to ask him that question.
That's great. So your website, let me make sure I'm plugging everything correctly here, because I want to make sure I get some of that stuff in. Your website, which is sort of a blog, I guess, is GizaDeathStar.com. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And
that's correct.
It doesn't look like you have much in the way of speaking engagement updates, so I'll go ahead and ask you directly about that, if you've got anything coming up or if you've done any recent interviews.
Well, I have not done, to be honest with you, Mike, I haven't done an interview since my last appearance on Coast to Coast, which was about about 2.5 months ago. I don't have any speaking engagements, at least as far as I know, for the rest of the year, but, you know, that can change at the last minute.
Sure. And you're definitely busy with books. I know, I see,
yes.
And this has really thrown me off, because I've tried so hard to track with your material. I see something... I've probably got these mixed up, but I see The Philosopher's Stone is an older book.
Yeah, that came out last year.
Right, but you have something new that's just now coming out that you said either went to the publisher or it's already reached it?
Well, I've already published 2 books this year. One of them was called Roswell and the Reich. That came out, I think, in February by Adventures Unlimited Press.
Gotcha.
And then I had another book come out about 2 months later from Farrell House, and that book is called Babylon's Banksters. So I've had 2 books come out. I just mailed a book to my publisher last Monday, and I'm starting the research for yet another that I'm contracted to finish before the end of the year. So yeah, I stay pretty busy.
Sure, nothing wrong with that. So would you give us just a brief overview of those books? Just sort of where you are with those.
Well, I have basically 2 tracks that I've been on thus far. There's a series of books dealing with ancient history and ancient technologies that began with a book called Giza Death Star and continued up through a book called The Cosmic War, and then my last installment was Babylon's Banksters. It gets into a lot of the ancient history and ancient technology. And then the book I just sent off kind of continues in that vein. The other set of books deals largely and primarily with Nazi secret weapons and what I believe to be kind of the radical physics that was behind them that they were investigating. So there's basically 2 different tracks.
Right. Now, I'll go ahead and ask a question I'm sure you're hit with a lot, and it's fascinating to me, but your degree, you're a doctor, your degree was in, if I'm not mistaken, patristics. Is that correct, from Oxford?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and could you, I could try to ramble off an explanation of patristics, but you're probably used to answering that question. So if you could just give me a quick 2 sentences on what patristics actually is.
Well, patristics is the study of the early church fathers and how they formulated various ecclesiastical doctrines. So what you do in patristics, obviously, is you deal with a lot of ancient texts. You deal a lot with languages, and by the nature of the case, you are dealing with a period of history that's roughly 1,500 years long. So you deal a lot with the history of philosophy, the history of science, a great deal with the development of law in the Middle Ages, and so on and so forth. So it sounds like a rather narrow degree, but it's actually quite the reverse. You have to have a fairly broad background in order to do it.
Sure. And among the languages, I mean, I think a couple of the obvious hits would be like Latin and probably maybe some Hebrew, but what else would be mixed in there?
Well, you certainly have to have Greek, depending on the field that you specialize in. That can even branch out into things like Coptic or Armenian and so on and so forth. And then you have, with modern languages, if you're going to do patristics, you also have to have a pretty good ability to read French and German, since so much of the scholarship is published in those languages. So, yeah, your language skills, you don't want to get into it if you don't want to multitask.
Yeah,
let's put it that way.
Exactly. And really just maximize the ability to think through some of that, and just the translation alone must be a challenge unto itself.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So, listen, the number one thing, and this is where I would go ahead and just reach right out to our audience, because what we try to do is to challenge our listeners. I'm the type of person that will sit around and listen to Dreamland and Coast to Coast and some of these other shows, and I'm often surprised when I reach out to either listeners or just friends, people on the street, and they say, yeah, I'm familiar with that, but I don't really listen to it. And, it's more the mainstream, the average Joe walking the street that we kind of reach out to, and we have tuning in to say, well, what is all this stuff that I hear from George Norrie and Strieber and these other guys? So let me start with a very easy, basic question, because for a guy like you to give this to us, I know what sort of a cliff I'm stepping off of, but I think that there's a lot of people out there that won't. I'm friends with somebody who has a degree, just a bachelor's degree, I guess. He might have a master's, but in World War II history. And I was having a conversation with him one evening, and I said something about, hey, did you see the History Channel special that indicated that Saddam Hussein, that his uncle, had been in some brigade that was part of the Nazi, military during World War II? And he almost drove off the road looking at me, well, what are you talking about? And I said, well, no, it was just on History Channel. And this special that I'm referring is probably 3 years old, maybe more at this point. But to get to the point, you write about the Nazis and Nazi technology, and if you really pay attention to the details, the Nazis are a group that not only survived past World War II, but clearly beyond the skinheads and the people that maybe we see on television, is really a thriving enterprise today. You refer to it in the titles of your books as Nazi International. It's still a worldwide major corporation. I mean, is that that's how you look at it?
Yes, it is. The basic thesis that I developed in that book called The Nazi International is that Nazism survived the war, but when I say survived, I mean something very different from the standard view that you get, in most books and so on and so forth. I mean by it that Nazism survived as an organized, coherent, well-financed entity that extended a great deal of financial influence throughout the world. But more importantly, and for me this is really the crucial point, that there is strong evidence that they continued independently of any of the Allied powers that won World War II to investigate the secret weapons and technologies and the physics behind them after the war, and to do so independently. Now, I realize that's probably a whopper for most people to swallow.
Exactly.
But I do go out of my way in the Nazi International to argue my case based on American paperclip scientists' files themselves. So in other words, it's not a case that I'm, just making up and channeling, as it were, but I'm trying to argue and base it on documentary evidence and some other things and considerations that are actually in the record if you just want to go out and look for them.
Sure.
So, yeah, I do believe that there is such an organization that survived the war and that it became very, very powerful.
Now, first of all, Paperclip, for those who aren't familiar, was a program, I guess, enacted by the U.S. government to bring over German scientists immediately after the war. And we'll go into that in just a second. But something that I read in SS Brotherhood of the Bell, which I assume you probably posit in a couple of your other books, is this idea that the U.S. program, Paperclip, was not a standalone program, that the Russians had their own version of it, and I remember hearing this in interviews and reading this a little bit too, that there was even possibly a third party that was simply trying to play the Americans and the Russians against each other, and that everybody was like a triple agent mixed in here.
Well, yes, that third party, essentially, as far as I'm concerned, is this Nazi international organization. And the reason I say that, and you make very good allusion to this fact, and that is that the CIA, basically, at the end of World War II, under the organization that preceded it, called the OSS, negotiated or brokered a deal with General Reinhard Gehlen, who was the German general that was in charge of their military intelligence on the Eastern Front. And he had quite an extensive network inside of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, some 4,000 agents. Well, the long and short of it, Michael, is that as a result of that deal that was negotiated by Allen Dulles, who later became a director of the CIA, the upshot of it is that as a result of this deal, effectively what this meant was that the operational Soviet desk of the CIA was really nothing but a front for a house of Nazi spies. So, yeah, so in my opinion, once a Nazi, always a Nazi, and you have to look rather carefully at some of the actions of Gehlen's intelligence organization immediately after the war, because to a certain extent, the Cold War was brought on precisely by his organization's overestimations of Soviet military strength and intentions.
Right, which I've heard you use as a direct example to illustrate how they were playing against each other, and using those overestimations, obviously driving the Cold War into what it was, which serves their purposes better than it could possibly serve the Americans or the Russians.
Right, and you mentioned also the idea of triple agents. Well, it's pointed out by many people that Gehlen's organization was heavily penetrated by the KGB, and this is true, but we do not know the extent or the effect of these double agents on Soviet estimations and intelligence analysis. So in other words, my idea, again, is once a Nazi, always a Nazi. There is always the possibility that in the end, they remain loyal to the cause and were playing both sides against the middle.